Elliot's heart pounded so hard he thought it might shatter his ribs. He stood on the creaking porch of his grandmother's house, the summer air thick with the scent of jasmine and the weight of his confession. At 19, he had just told his family he was gay, and the world felt like it was caving in. Rose, his grandmother, sat beside him, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Her eyes, sharp despite her 70 years, held a quiet strength that made Elliot feel anchored. Even as his father's words echoed in his mind, "You're no son of mine." The memory stung, raw and unrelenting. But Rose's presence was a balm. She had always been his safe harbor. The one who baked him cookies when he was a kid and told him stories of her own rebellious youth in this small Ohio town. Now, she was his shield. The only one who hadn't turned away when he'd bared his soul at the family dinner table. The night had started with hope. Elliot had practiced his words for weeks, scribbling them in a notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. He'd chosen the annual family barbecue at his parents' house, thinking the warmth of grilled burgers and laughter might soften the blow. His mother, Linda, had been fussing over the potato salad, while his father, Tom, manned the grill, his face set in its usual stoic mask. Grandpa Frank, Rose's husband, sat in a lawn chair, nursing a beer and muttering about the Reds' losing streak. It was a scene so familiar it ached, and Elliot had believed naively. He now realized that love would outweigh their judgment. "I'm gay," he'd said, his voice trembling but clear, as the family sat around the picnic table. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. His mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. His father's jaw tightened, and Frank's beer bottle hit the table with a thud. Only Rose had reached for his hand under the table, her grip steady and warm. "Elliot," she'd whispered, "I'm proud of you." But the moment shattered. Tom stood, his chair scraping against the deck. "You think this is a game?" he'd shouted, his face red with fury. "You think you can just disgrace us like this?" Linda's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing, her silence cutting deeper than words. Frank, ever the patriarch, had leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "This ain't natural. Boy, you need fixing." Elliot's chest tightened as he remembered the way his father's anger had escalated, fueled by Frank's quiet, insidious agreement. By the end of the night, Tom had given him an ultimatum: leave or be fixed. Elliot chose to leave, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he walked the 3 miles to Rose's house, tears blurring the streetlights. Now, sitting on her porch, Elliot felt the weight of her gaze. "You're not alone," Rose said, her voice firm but soft. "You'll always have me." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photo of herself and Elliot's mother as a teenager, laughing under a willow tree. "Families fight, Elliot. They break. But they can mend, too." He wanted to believe her, but the sting of his father's rejection was too fresh. "Dad listens to Grandpa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And Grandpa thinks I'm wrong." Rose's lips pressed into a thin line. "Frank's a stubborn old fool. But he's not the end of this story. Neither is your father." She stood, her arthritic knees creaking, and motioned for him to follow her inside. The house smelled of lavender and old books, a comforting contrast to the chaos of the night. She led him to the guest room, where a quilt she'd made decades ago lay folded on the bed. "Sleep," she said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure this out." Elliot lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the quilt heavy on his chest. He thought of his father's rage, his mother's silence, and Frank's cold judgment. But he also thought of Rose, her unwavering love a lifeline in the storm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in hours, He felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, and the smell of coffee pulled Elliot from a restless sleep. He found Rose in the kitchen, flipping pancakes with a precision that belied her age. "Eat," she said, sliding a plate toward him. "You'll need your strength." As he ate, she told him about her plan. She'd called a local support group for LGBTQ youth, run by a woman named Clara who'd been helping kids like Elliot for decades. "You're not the first to go through this," Rose said, her eyes gentle but fierce. "And you won't be the last. But you're going to be okay." Elliot nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know Clara, but the idea of a community people who might understand felt like a lifeline. Rose drove him to the community center that afternoon, her old Buick rattling down the quiet streets. The center was a modest brick building, its walls covered in flyers for art classes and book clubs. Inside, Clara greeted them, her warm smile easing Elliot's nerves. She was in her 50s, with short gray hair and a rainbow pin on her jacket. "Welcome, Elliot," Clara said, shaking his hand. "You're safe here." The group was small but vibrant, a mix of teens and young adults sharing stories of struggle and resilience. Elliot listened, his heart racing, as a girl named Mia talked about her own coming out, her words raw and honest. For the first time, he felt seen, like his truth wasn't a burden, but a shared thread connecting him to others. As they drove home, Rose glanced at him. "You're stronger than you know," she said, "and I'll fight for you, no matter what." But back at home, the reality of his family's rejection loomed. Frank had called, leaving a voicemail that Rose played on speaker. "Rose, you're enabling him," Frank's voice growled. "You're tearing this family apart." Elliot's stomach churned. He knew Frank's influence over his father was a wall he'd have to climb. But with Rose by his side, he felt ready to face it. The battle was just beginning. But for now, he had a home, a grandmother who loved him, and a spark of courage that refused to die. Elliot woke to the sound of gravel crunching under tires. He peered through the guest room window, his heart sinking as he saw his father's pickup truck idling in Rose's driveway. Tom stepped out, his face a mask of determination, and Elliot knew this wasn't a visit to reconcile. Rose was already at the door when Elliot reached the living room, her small frame blocking the entrance like a sentinel. "Tom," she said, her voice steady, "if you're here to hurt him, you can turn around right now." "I'm here to talk sense into him," Tom snapped, his eyes flicking past her to Elliot. "He's confused. Ma, Frank's right, this isn't who he is." Elliot's hands clenched at his sides, the familiar ache of rejection flaring in his chest. He wanted to shout, to tell his father he wasn't confused, that he'd known who he was since he was 15, stealing glances at the quarterback in gym class. But the words stuck in his throat, choked by the fear of losing his father forever. Rose didn't budge. "He's your son, Tom. Not a problem to fix." Her voice trembled with a mix of love and fury, and Elliot saw the toll this fight was taking on her. She'd always been the family's glue, the one who mediated arguments and soothed tempers. But now she was drawing a line in the sand. Tom's face softened for a moment, but then his jaw tightened. "Frank says there's programs. Ma. Camps. They can help him be normal." "Normal?" Rose's voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the morning air. "You think love needs fixing? You think your son's heart is something to be ashamed of?" Elliot stepped forward, his voice finally breaking free. "Dad, I'm not broken. I'm just me." His eyes stung, but he held his father's gaze, willing him to see the truth. Tom looked away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You're making a choice, Elliot, and it's the wrong one." He turned back to his truck, pausing only to say, "Frank's coming over tonight. We're going to talk this out as a family." The door closed, and Elliot sank onto the couch, his breath shaky. Rose sat beside him, her hand finding his. "He's scared," she said softly. "Fear makes people say things they don't mean." But Elliot wasn't so sure. Frank's influence over his father was like a shadow, dark and unyielding. He'd seen it growing up. Frank's word was law in their family, his conservative values shaping every decision. Elliot had once overheard Frank telling Tom that men like that didn't belong in their town, their church, their family. The memory made his stomach twist. That afternoon, Elliot returned to the community center, seeking the solace he'd found the day before. Clara noticed his tension immediately and pulled him aside. "You look like you're carrying the world," she said, her voice kind but direct. "Want to talk?" He told her everything: a barbecue, his father's ultimatum, Frank's venomous words. Clara listened, her face a mix of empathy and resolve. "Families take time," she said. "Some come around, some don't. But you build your own family. Two people who choose you." Her words lingered as Elliot joined the group, where Mia shared a story about her girlfriend, Sarah, who'd stood by her when her parents hadn't. The group laughed and cried together, and Elliot felt a warmth he hadn't known was possible. He wasn't alone. Not entirely. Back at Rose's, the air was thick with tension as they prepared for Frank's visit. Rose cooked dinner: roast chicken and mashed potatoes, a meal meant to ground them, but Elliot could barely eat. When Frank arrived, his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. He was tall, with a grizzled beard and eyes that seemed to judge everything they landed on. "Rose, you're coddling him," Frank said, not even glancing at Elliot. "This nonsense stops now. I've got a friend who runs a program in Columbus. They'll set him straight." Elliot's heart raced, but Rose's voice was steel. "You don't get to decide who he is, Frank. And if you can't love him, you don't get to call yourself family." Frank's face reddened, but before he could respond, the doorbell rang. It was Mia, holding a tray of cookies from the support group. "Thought you could use some backup," she said with a grin, stepping inside. Her presence shifted the room's energy, a small act of defiance against Frank's judgment. Elliot felt a surge of gratitude, and as Mia sat beside him, he realized Clara was building a new family, one that saw him for who he was. But as Frank's eyes narrowed, Elliot knew the fight was far from over. Dinner was a battlefield. Frank sat at the head of Rose's dining table, his fork stabbing at the chicken like it had personally offended him. Elliot sat across from him, Mia on one side, Rose on the other, their presence a fragile shield against the storm brewing in Frank's silence. "You think you can just waltz in here with cookies and make this okay?" Frank finally said, his eyes fixed on Mia. "This is a family matter." Mia didn't flinch. "Elliot's my friend," she said, her voice steady. "That makes it my matter, too." Frank snorted, turning to Rose. "You're letting strangers into our business now. This boy needs discipline, not a cheerleader." Elliot's face burned, but Rose's hand on his arm kept him grounded. "Enough, Frank," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "You're in my house. You respect my grandson, or you leave." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Frank leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You're choosing him over family, Rose. Over me." "I'm choosing love," she shot back. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Elliot's heart swelled, but the weight of Frank's words lingered. He knew his grandfather's influence ran deep, especially with Tom. After dinner, as Mia helped Rose clear the table, Frank pulled Elliot aside in the hallway. "Your father's coming around," he said, his voice a low growl. "He's ready to send you to that camp. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Fear gripped Elliot's chest, but he squared his shoulders. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I'm not ashamed of who I am." Frank's eyes darkened, but before he could respond, Rose appeared, her presence a quiet force. "That's enough. Frank, go home." Frank left without another word, but his threat hung in the air like smoke. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep, his mind racing with images of conversion camps and his father's cold rejection. He slipped out to the porch, where Mia found him, her jacket pulled tight against the chilly night. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Not really," he admitted, staring at the stars. "I keep thinking, what if they force me to go?" Mia's eyes softened. "They can't force you to be someone you're not. And you've got Rose. You've got us." Her words were a lifeline, but the fear lingered. The next day, Elliot threw himself into the support group, helping Clara organize a fundraiser for queer youth. It was a small act, but it gave him purpose, a way to fight the darkness creeping in. He met Sarah, Mia's girlfriend, a quiet artist with a sharp wit who showed him sketches she'd done of the group, each face captured with care and dignity. "You're part of this now," Sarah said, handing him a sketch of himself, his eyes bright with determination. The gesture hit him hard, a reminder that he was more than his family's rejection. But the tension at home escalated. Tom called, his voice strained, saying he'd be over to settle things. Elliot's stomach churned, but Rose was resolute. "We'll face him together," she said, her eyes fierce with love. When Tom arrived, he looked tired, his shoulders slumped. "Elliot," he said, his voice softer than before, "I don't understand this. But Frank says it's fixable. I just want my son back." Elliot's throat tightened. "I'm right here, Dad. I've always been here." Tom's eyes flickered with something regret. Maybe, but he shook his head. "Frank's got a place lined up. It's for your own good." Rose stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "Tom, if you send him away, you're not just losing him. You're losing me." The ultimatum hung heavy, and for the first time, Tom looked uncertain. Elliot saw a crack in his father's resolve, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, love could win. But Frank's shadow loomed, and Elliot knew the fight was far from over. The air in Rose's living room was thick with unspoken words as Tom stood by the door, his hands fidgeting. Elliot watched his father, searching for the man who'd once taught him to ride a bike, who'd cheered at his soccer games. That man felt like a ghost now, overshadowed by Frank's rigid beliefs. "I don't want to lose you, Elliot," Tom said finally, his voice cracking. "But I can't. I can't accept this." Elliot's heart ached, but he held his ground. "Then you're not accepting me, Dad. This is who I am." Rose stepped between them, her small frame radiating strength. "Tom, you're letting Frank poison you. He's not your father's mind. And I'm telling you, he's wrong." Tom's eyes darted to the floor, conflict etched in every line of his face. "He says it's a sin, Ma. That it's against everything we were raised to believe." "And I say love is never a sin," Rose replied, her voice steady but fierce. "You think God made Elliot just to break him. You think that's the plan." Tom didn't answer, but the silence was heavy with doubt. He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Elliot sank onto the couch, his chest tight with a mix of hope and fear. Rose sat beside him, her hand finding his. "He's thinking," she said. "That's a start." The next day, Elliot threw himself into the fundraiser at the community center. Clara had organized a talent show, and the room buzzed with energy kids singing, dancing, sharing poetry. Elliot helped set up chairs, his hands busy but his mind racing. Mia and Sarah were there, painting a mural on the center's wall, a vibrant explosion of color that spelled out chosen family. Elliot felt a pang of longing, wishing his own family could see him the way this group did. During a break, Clara pulled him aside. "You're doing good here, Elliot," she said, "but I see the weight you're carrying. Talk to me." He hesitated, then spilled everything: Tom's wavering, Frank's threats, Rose's fierce love. Clara nodded, her eyes kind but resolute. "You're building something here," she said, gesturing to the room. "A life. Don't let them take that from you." Her words stuck with him, a reminder that he had power, even in the face of rejection. That evening, he and Mia sat on Rose's porch, sharing leftover cookies from the fundraiser. "You ever think about leaving?" Mia asked, her voice soft. "Starting fresh somewhere else?" Elliot stared at the horizon, the town's lights flickering in the distance. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But Rose, she's fighting for me. I can't just leave her." Mia nodded, her eyes reflecting the same quiet strength he'd come to rely on. "You're lucky to have her. And us." The moment was shattered by the sound of Frank's truck pulling up. He stormed up the porch steps, his face a mask of fury. "Rose," he bellowed, banging on the door. "We're settling this tonight." Rose opened the door, her expression calm but unyielding. "Frank, you're not welcome here if you're bringing hate." Frank's eyes flicked to Elliot, then Mia. "You're filling his head with nonsense." He spat. "This stops now. Tom's made up his mind, signing the papers for the camp tomorrow." Elliot's blood ran cold. He looked at Rose, whose face had gone pale but resolute. "Over my dead body," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You and Tom can try, but you'll have to go through me." Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't push further. He left, his truck peeling out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust and dread. Elliot turned to Rose, his voice trembling. "What if Dad really does it?" Rose pulled him into a hug, her arms surprisingly strong. "He won't," she said. "I'll make sure of it." But as Elliot lay awake that night, the fear gnawed at him. He knew Rose would fight, but Frank's influence was a tidal wave, and Tom was caught in its pull. The battle for his future was escalating, and Elliot wasn't sure who would win. Morning brought a fragile calm, but Elliot could feel the storm brewing. Rose was already up, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes fixed on the phone. "I called your mother," she said as Elliot entered the kitchen. "She's coming over today?" Elliot's heart skipped. Linda had been silent since the barbecue, her absence a wound he hadn't yet processed. Does she want to see me?" he asked, his voice small. Rose's eyes softened. "She's confused, Elliot. But she loves you. I know she does." The wait for Linda's arrival felt endless. Elliot busied himself helping Rose in the garden, pulling weeds with a ferocity that betrayed his anxiety. The sun was high when Linda's car pulled up, her face pale as she stepped out. She looked at Elliot, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and longing. "Elliot," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything that night. I didn't know how." He wanted to be angry, but all he felt was relief. "Mom," he said, stepping closer, "I just need you to see me." Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled him into a hug, her embrace tight and desperate. "I see you," she whispered. "I'm trying." Rose watched from the porch, her expression unreadable. When Linda joined them, she sat across from Rose, her hands twisting in her lap. "Tom's under Frank's thumb," Linda said. "He's talking about that camp again. I don't know how to stop him." Rose's face hardened. "We stop him by showing him what he's losing," she said. "Elliot's not going anywhere." The conversation was cut short by a call from Clara, inviting Elliot to a community center event, that evening vigil for queer youth who'd faced rejection. "Bring your mom," Clara said. "Let her see what you're part of." Elliot hesitated, but Linda agreed, her eyes curious and cautious. That night, the community center glowed with candlelight, the room filled with faces young and old, each holding a story of struggle and hope. Elliot stood beside Mia and Sarah, his mother at his side, as Clara spoke about resilience and chosen family. Linda's hand found his, squeezing tightly as a young man shared a story of surviving a conversion camp, his voice raw with pain. Elliot saw the horror in his mother's eyes, the realization of what Tom and Frank were pushing for. "I won't let that happen to you," she whispered, her voice fierce with newfound resolve. But the victory was short-lived. When they returned to Rose's, Tom was waiting, his face set in a grim line. Frank stood beside him, his presence a dark anchor. "Linda," Tom said, "you're either with us or against us." Linda's eyes flashed with defiance. "I'm with my son," she said, stepping in front of Elliot. "And if you can't see that, you're the one who's lost." Frank's voice was cold. "You're making a mistake, Linda. This family doesn't bend to sin." Rose stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "This family bends to love, Frank. And if you can't understand that, you're the one who doesn't belong." The standoff was electric, each word a spark in a powder keg. Elliot felt the weight of his family's divide. But for the first time, he saw his mother fighting for him, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rose. It wasn't over, but it was a turning point, a moment where love began to outweigh fear. The standoff lingered in the air, a fragile truce that felt like it could shatter with a single word. Tom's eyes darted between Linda and Rose, his resolve wavering under their united front. Frank, however, stood unyielding, his arms crossed, his face a mask of righteous certainty. "You're all blind," Frank said, his voice low and venomous. "This boy's headed down a dark path, and you're paving the way." Elliot's chest tightened, but Linda's hand on his arm kept him steady. "The only darkness here is your hate, Frank," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Elliot's my son, and I'm done letting you dictate what that means." Tom flinched, his eyes flickering with doubt. "Linda, I just want what's best for him," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then listen to him," Rose said, stepping closer. "Not Frank. Not the church. Your son." The room fell silent, the weight of Rose's words sinking in. Tom looked at Elliot, really looked at him, for the first time since the barbecue. "I don't understand you," he said quietly, "but I don't want to lose you." Elliot's throat burned with unshed tears. "Then don't, Dad," he said. "Just try." Frank scoffed, turning to leave. "You're all fools," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Tom, when you come to your senses, you know where to find me." As Frank's truck roared away, Elliot felt a shift, like the first crack in a dam. Tom stayed, sitting awkwardly at Rose's kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd poured him. The conversation was halting, painful, but it was a start. Tom asked questions, clumsy, hesitant ones about what it meant to be gay, about Elliot's life. Linda filled in gaps, her voice soft but steady. sharing what she'd learned at the vigil. Elliot spoke, too, his words raw and honest. He told them about the fear of coming out, the joy of finding a community, the pain of their rejection. "I just want to be me," he said, his voice breaking, "and I want you to love me for it." Tom didn't have all the answers, but he listened, and that was more than Elliot had dared hope for. When Tom left that night, he hugged Elliot, a brief, awkward embrace, but a hug nonetheless. "I'll try," he whispered, and Elliot clung to those words like a lifeline. The next day, Elliot returned to the community center, his heart lighter but still cautious. Mia and Sarah were there, painting the mural, and Clara pulled him into a hug. "You're doing okay, kid," she said, her eyes warm. "Keep going." The fundraiser was a success, the talent show raising enough to fund a new youth program. Elliot performed a poem he'd written, his voice shaking but clear, each word a piece of his truth. The crowd cheered, and he felt a surge of pride, a reminder that he was building a life worth living. But Frank's shadow lingered. A week later, Elliot overheard Rose on the phone, her voice sharp with anger. "You will not touch him, Frank," she said. "I don't care what you think is right." When she hung up, she told Elliot the truth. Frank was pushing Tom to reconsider the camp, claiming it was the only way to save the family. Elliot's stomach churned, but Rose's eyes were fierce. "He won't win," she said. "Not while I'm here." That night, Elliot sat with Rose on the porch, the stars bright above them. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice small. "What if Dad listens to him again?" Rose took his hand, her grip strong despite her age. "Then we keep fighting," she said. "You, me, your mom, your friends. We're your family now." Her words settled into his bones, a reminder that love was worth fighting for. Elliot knew the road ahead would be rough, but with Rose by his side, he felt ready to face it. Weeks passed, and the tension in Elliot's life settled into a strange rhythm. Tom's visits to Rose's house became more frequent, each one a tentative step toward understanding. They talked about small things: work, the weather, old memories, but Elliot could feel the unspoken questions lingering. Linda was a constant presence now, her support growing stronger with each passing day. She'd started attending the community center's family support group, learning to navigate her own fears and guilt. But Frank remained a shadow over their progress. He refused to come to Rose's house, his absence a silent protest. But his influence lingered in Tom's hesitations. Elliot overheard a phone call one evening, Frank's voice booming through the speaker. "You're letting them win, Tom," he said. "You're letting your son become something he's not." Elliot's heart sank, but Tom's response gave him hope. "He's my son, Frank," Tom said, his voice firm. "I'm trying to understand him. You should, too." The words were a small victory, but they didn't erase the fear. Elliot threw himself into the community center, finding solace in the routine of helping Clara, painting with Mia and Sarah, and mentoring younger kids in the group. One boy, Jamie, a shy 15-year-old, reminded Elliot of himself, scared but desperate to be seen. Elliot listened to Jamie's stories, offering the kind of support he wished he'd had at that age. One afternoon, Clara pulled Elliot aside. "You're a natural," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Ever thought about leading a group here?" The idea stunned him. He'd never seen himself as a leader, but the thought of helping others like Jamie lit a spark in him. "Maybe," he said, a smile tugging at his lips. "I'd like that." That evening, Rose hosted a small dinner for the community center group, a celebration of the fundraiser's success. The house was filled with laughter, The table crowded with plates of lasagna and stories of hope. Linda was there, her smile brighter than Elliot had seen in years. Even Tom showed up, his presence awkward but earnest. He didn't say much, but he listened, his eyes softening as Mia talked about her dreams of opening an art studio with Sarah. As the night wound down, Elliot stepped outside for air, his heart full but heavy. Rose joined him, her shawl wrapped tightly against the autumn chill. "You're building something beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "I'm so proud of you." Elliot's eyes stung. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You saved me." Rose shook her head. "You saved yourself, Elliot. I just gave you a place to stand." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Frank's truck, its headlights cutting through the dusk. Elliot's stomach dropped as Frank stormed up the driveway, his face a mask of fury. "Rose," he shouted, "this has gone far enough." Rose faced him, her small frame unyielding. "What's gone far enough is your hate, Frank," she said. "Elliot's not your pawn." Frank's eyes locked on Elliot. "You're tearing this family apart," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You and your friends." Elliot stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear. "I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just trying to live." Frank's face twisted, but before he could respond, Tom appeared, his expression torn. "Frank, stop," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is my son, my family." The words hit like a thunderclap. Frank's eyes widened, but he said nothing, turning and storming back to his truck. As the engine roared to life, Elliot felt a weight lift, a sense that the tide was turning. Tom looked at Elliot, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and resolve. "I'm not there yet," he said, "but I'm trying." Elliot nodded, his throat tight. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for now. Winter settled over the small Ohio town, blanketing the streets in snow and quiet. Elliot stood on Rose's porch, his breath visible in the crisp air, watching the neighborhood glow under the holiday lights. It had been 3 months since Frank's last confrontation, and the family's wounds were slowly healing. Tom had started attending the family support group with Linda, his questions growing more thoughtful, his silences less heavy. He'd even come to the community center's holiday party, standing awkwardly by the punch bowl but smiling when Elliot performed another poem. It wasn't acceptance. Not fully. But it was progress, a bridge being built, one shaky step at a time. Frank, however, remained distant. He'd stopped calling, his absence a silent rebuke. Rose bore the weight of it, her face etched with quiet grief. But she never wavered in her support for Elliot. "He'll come around," she said one evening, her voice soft but certain. "Or he won't. But that's his choice, not yours." Elliot had grown, too. He'd taken Clara's suggestion and started leading a weekly group for queer teens, his voice steady as he shared his story. Jamie, the shy 15-year-old, had become his shadow, his confidence growing under Elliot's guidance. The community center had become Elliot's anchor, a place where he was seen, valued, and loved for who he was. One snowy afternoon, Elliot sat with Mia and Sarah at a local coffee shop, the three of them planning a spring art show for the center. "You're different," Mia said, her eyes warm, stronger. Elliot smiled, stirring his coffee. "I'm still scared sometimes," he admitted, "but I know who I am now." That evening, Rose called a family meeting, her first since the barbecue. Tom and Linda arrived, their faces a mix of hope and caution. To Elliot's surprise, Frank was there, too, his expression unreadable. Rose stood at the head of the table, her voice steady as she spoke. "We're family," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "And family doesn't always agree. But it loves. It tries. Elliot's shown us what courage looks like. It's time we show him what love looks like." Tom nodded, his eyes on Elliot. "I'm proud of you," he said, the words awkward but sincere. "I'm still learning, but I'm proud." Linda's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for Elliot's hand. "I love you," she said simply, and Elliot felt the weight of years of fear lift from his shoulders. Frank remained silent, his hands folded tightly in his lap. But as the evening wore on, he looked at Elliot, his eyes softer than before. "I don't understand you," he said finally, "but you're my grandson." It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the Walla small, fragile opening. Elliot nodded, his heart full. He knew Frank's journey would be long, if it ever happened at all. But he didn't need Frank's approval anymore. He had Rose, his parents, his chosen family. He had himself. As the family dispersed, Elliot stepped onto the porch, Rose at his side. The snow fell softly, blanketing the world in quiet. "You did it," Rose said, her voice warm with pride. "We did it," Elliot corrected, pulling her into a hug. "Thank you." They stood together, the cold air sharp but the warmth between them undeniable. Elliot looked out at the town, its lights a constellation of hope. He was home not just in Rose's house, but in his own skin, surrounded by love that had fought to find him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, knowing he was never alone.